U.S. history, welcome back to class. Okay, this PowerPoint is going to be the last chunk of notes that I'm doing that directly ties into the 1960s. So we're going to kind of wrap up this decade with Lyndon Johnson's Great Society reforms, which is a whole slew of legislation that comes through in 1964 and 65 and really dramatically changes kind of the scope and what the federal government is doing in relation to just the general public. And these reforms go into effect through the late 60s and really impact the end of that decade. And actually, a lot of the programs are still around today and have kind of permanently changed the federal government and American society. They're also a lot of them are quite controversial. Some people are big fans of Lyndon Johnson. A lot of people are very critical of him. I'll let you make up your own mind on that. But as always, I recommend that you do take jot down some notes of the highlights. There will be several things from this slideshow that will be covered on an upcoming quiz, and I will have some of the semester 2 exam questions that would tie into this. So I'll try to, as we go through, I'll try to highlight the most important things that you would definitely want to have accounted for in your notes. This would fit in really good with your civil rights era notes. I know we have 2 pages going on. Some stuff is foreign policy and would go into your Cold War notes, which this Cold War is still raging in 1964, 65, right through that whole decade. But this stuff, the Great Society reforms, are more domestic policy laws that would affect Americans here on the home front. So that's where I would include it. Okay, so LBJ, that stands for that like acronym or the initials is Lyndon Baines Johnson. If you don't know that, I would definitely account for that. So LBJ is President Johnson. He's the guy that it takes over after Kennedy's assassinated. And then in 1964, he gets elected on his own and serves, he's the duly elected president and serves a whole term. Then by 1968, probably because of the Vietnam War more than anything, he ends up deciding not to run again. Well, in 1964, this is right after he is elected in his own right and is going to be serving a term, but is still kind of part of the Kennedy legacy, because that was how he became president when Kennedy was assassinated. He uses Kennedy's name and he kind of goes through and says, we're going to implement a lot of these reforms that President Kennedy would have wanted. Also, Lyndon Johnson had been a very successful congressman who had gotten a lot of legislation through back in decades of being on Capitol Hill. So in 1964, right after the election, he starts to go around and give a lot of speeches that are kind of going through and highlighting what his vision is for the future and a bunch of laws and kind of an overarching strategy for what direction he wants to take the country in. One of the first places that he went and kind of unveiled the Great Society reforms and lays it all out was actually at a graduation ceremony at University of Michigan in 1964, where he was speaking out at the big house and outdoor that massive stadium. So here's a quote from Lyndon Johnson, one of the first speeches he gave on the Great Society reforms. "We are going to assemble the best thought and broadest knowledge from all over the world to find these answers. I intend to establish working groups to prepare a series of conferences and meetings on the cities, on natural beauty, on the quality of education, and on other emerging challenges. From these studies, we will begin to, set our course toward the Great Society." So kind of a catchy term there. I would compare that to like kind of a generation before in the 1930s during the Great Depression. President FDR, another president that goes by his initials, had unveiled the New Deal reforms, where that really kind of increases the size of government. Really, the Great Society reforms are going to do the same thing. And I'll get into more of the details here in a minute. But you can see from his quote, he's trying to say he's going to do studies, and they're going to have panels come together and include a lot of the smartest people, and they're going to look at data, and then from that they're going to pass legislation through that's going to try to remedy a lot of different problems that were going on in the 1960s in America. Okay, so Great Society intentions. For this one, I'm kind of going over, and I do think whether you're a fan of Lyndon Johnson or not, which he has, a lot of people think he was a great president, and then there's a lot of people that are very critical of him and think that he didn't do a very good job as being president for a variety of reasons. But whether you like him or not, and I honestly think maybe the overall if you're going to look at a net gain or a net negative, I think the Great Society had great intentions, and I will give President Johnson credit for that. I think he truly, truly wanted to make the country a better place and help people out. But then I think there ends up being a lot of unintended consequences to some of these policies that he enacted. But I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and say I think he had kind of a pure heart going into it and was trying to do the right thing for a majority of the American people. So it's going to be a set of domestic or home front. Whenever you hear domestic, it's talking at home. Internal policies and programs that really go into effect in 1964 and 65. Most presidents, when they get elected, usually kind of like what had happened with President Obama, with President Trump, and with President Biden. When a president gets elected and it goes from one party controlling the White House to the other, usually it's kind of a sweep election and they generally have both houses of Congress. However, also what is very, very normal, usually the next midterm elections, 2 years later, so halfway through that president's first term, typically on average, usually Congress swings back over to the other party. So then that creates a situation where there's divided government. So what I'm kind of trying to maybe babbling on a little too much about, most presidents, when they come in, they have that first 1 to 2 years to get a lot of their agenda through. And then by the time they're halfway through their term, typically Congress goes to the other party, and then that creates gridlock, and it's much harder to get policies in. So all of these great society reforms, even though they're still in effect in the late 60s and changing the country then, they all go into effect early on in his first term after he was elected in 1964 and 65. What's their intention? Well, a big part of the goal was they were designed to reduce poverty, and it kind of begins another quotation mark thing there for you. It begins kind of America's war on policy, which would parallel also like another one that starts after that is the war on drugs. I'm going to cover that in an upcoming lecture too, where the next president, Nixon, he kind of gets the ball rolling on that. But anyway, that's kind of a popular way of spinning things out, that we're going to war on poverty and we're going to try to raise standards of living. And I do think Johnson's intentions were definitely to do that. I think that's what he saw. That's what he wanted to be the staple of his presidency, was that he was going to lift Americans up and especially help out the poor people, the downtrodden. Also, I think the most successful part of the Great Society reforms were his attempts to end legal segregation, discrimination, and racism. A lot of that happened in the southern states. So I think a lot of the stuff where he, and this is subjective, this is a Taluki opinion, I think a lot of the policies that tried to reduce poverty didn't work like they were intended to. But I think a lot of the laws that were enacted, the policies that are enacted, and segregation and discrimination, especially in the southern states, I think those were pretty darn effective and were a good thing. So I'll definitely give Johnson credit for that, because getting rid of Jim Crow laws, passing the 1964 Civil Rights Act that basically said you can't have laws that give a different set of standards for black people and white people. That was not like a universally like embraced thing back in the 60s. There was a lot of pushback on that, and Johnson is a Southerner. He's from Texas. He's from one of those southern states. So it kind of almost needed to be somebody like him, a Southern politician that would take the lead on this, because he wasn't able to get all of the other Southern politicians on board with it, but he was able to get enough on board that he was able to get these laws passed. You got to understand the dynamic would have been a little bit different if it was Kennedy trying to do that. Kennedy was a popular and charismatic president, but he was a Northerner from Massachusetts. It's way more likely that the Southern politicians would have rallied together and kind of unified against him. Whereas Johnson, it was kind of seen as like, he's one of us. He's a Southerner too. So he was able to win some over, just, I think, because of that. And he was pretty persuasive in speaking, and really able to like twist people's arms and kind of persuade them to vote a certain way if you really wanted them to. Now, I would also compare them. You probably don't need to put this in here, but just to give you a comparison, if you remember us covering in the 1930s the New Deal reforms that FDR enrolled kind of in the height of the Great Depression, these are very similar. They're just a generation later, and kind of a different tweak on that kind of stuff. Now, I'll say this is something that I would write into your notes, but I don't care how you word it. Just be concise with it. Johnson, 100%. He wants his legacy, and legacy is like what you will be remembered for throughout history. He wants his legacy to be the Great Society. He wants to be that president that kind of got rid of segregation and discrimination and went to war on poverty and helped out the poor people around the country. Now, unfortunately for him, I think the way he handled the Vietnam War becomes his legacy more so, and that's definitely a negative. Pretty much, I think, like from both sides of the political aisle today would say Johnson didn't do a great job handling the Vietnam War because he escalated the conflict, and every time something went wrong, you'd send more troops over, casualty rates went up, and then we ultimately end up losing that war. So the Vietnam War in 1964-65 was still fairly popular. Most people believed that we're doing the right thing, standing up to communism. But by the end of his term, by 1968, that situation totally changes. And I think the Vietnam War becomes more of his legacy, although that probably kind of killed him inside because he felt like, man, I got a lot of other really important domestic laws passed, and this is what he wanted to be remembered for. It was the Great Society reforms. Okay, now some specific laws for you. You don't have to write down all of these. The ones I underlined are the ones that I would most likely, wink, wink, hint, hint, put on any quizzes or on the exam down the road. The first two on here, you definitely want to know these. I've mentioned them before. So if you've already covered these laws in your notes, if you look up higher on the page and they're there, you wouldn't need to write them in again, obviously. But you definitely want to know that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is an piece of legislation. This is happening at the height of the civil rights movement. It is like about a year after Martin Luther King gives his I Have a Dream speech. Essentially, what this law does, to just kind of boil it down really simply and concisely, it makes it so that the Jim Crow and the discriminatory laws of the southern states are essentially illegal. That you can't have two sets of standards and, have white bathrooms and black bathrooms, white drinking fountains and black ones, or the schools like black schools and white schools. It said you can't do that anymore, that public services have to be offered to all people and citizens and the residents of an area, and you can't discriminate based on color. So I think universally, most people would say that was a good piece of legislation. I give Johnson credit for that because it wasn't an easy law to get through. He did it. And I think that's had a profound impact on American history and started to move us more in the right direction. Another piece of legislation that is very important, and I also think was a very good piece of legislation that he got through, was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. After the Civil Rights Act went through, that cleaned up a lot, and it allowed a lot of those Southern Jim Crow laws to be challenged in the federal court system and get struck down. So these laws were like, you can't have these laws that discriminated against people. So they're getting weeded out through the 1960s, and those laws are kind of getting tossed out. One area, though, that the 64 Act was not quite cutting it was in the area of voting rights, where it was still much harder for Black people in a lot of Southern communities and small towns to get registered to vote. This says it's very clear and concise that you cannot discriminate based on race or gender or religion or anything like that for voting rights. That, if the rule is that you can vote when you're 18, hey, if you're not a felon and you have a clean record and you're a U.S. citizen, you get the right to vote. And it just made that really clear cut. So also a darn good law there that was very important. Now, some other ones that might be kind of familiar with. I'm guessing most of you have heard of these, but this is where these laws got going. This is where these programs get going. The Food Stamp Act of 1964. Essentially, it expanded a program that was already kind of around, but in small, but it expands the federal food stamp program to give people living below the poverty line food stamps so they go to the grocery store and ideally get nutritious foods. There was the Neighborhood Youth Corps. This was trying to give poor kids living in inner cities, many of them Black kids in inner cities, more opportunities and extracurriculars. Another big one that some of you might be familiar with is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Now, you probably haven't heard of that, but what you might be familiar with is The Head Start program, where it's basically like a government funded preschool. That's a pretty big change too, where it gets more kids, and it was designed to go and try to get young kids that were in really poverty stricken areas to try to get them a head start and get them into the school system a little bit sooner. And also, then that provides essentially daycare where the parents are more freed up to go pursue getting jobs. Then this is the other one that I do want you to write down that I have underlined. Social Security Act of 1965. Now, Social Security originally was one of the New Deal programs 30 years before that FDR got enrolled. That's kind of like you pay into the Social Security system through your whole adult life when you're working. And then when you hit whatever age they have it set at the time you retire, like at 65, I think it's 62 is when you could start drawing, but you can delay it and actually get a little more money if you wait till you're 65 or 66. Then it's kind of like a government pension program. Well, you'll get money back out of the system at that point when you're old and retiring. He expands onto that and then key points here. That one, this is what I would want you to add into it. The Social Security system was already around, the pension program, but he adds on Medicare, Medicaid, and he expands a lot of other benefits would help people in certain situations, like if they're disabled. Or I had a friend that I went to high school with where his dad died a very untimely death from ALS when he was in high school, and he was able to get some checks essentially for the until he was 18 because of that loss of income, because his dad died unexpectedly. Social Security helped him out until he was of adult age. So that is as a result of this Social Security Act of 1965. Also, another one you may have heard of. I won't be on any tests or quizzes, but he starts up the Peace Corps. That's another one where it's like kind of a travel abroad program where students from America will go generally to poorer countries and go build houses and do things there, and maybe go to a school in Haiti or over in the Philippines. And it's kind of a cultural exchange program where our students will go over and help out, generally in a poor area, and they get that cultural experience and then come back with their experiences to America. All right. Next up, now, the effects of the Great Society. A lot of people would be very critical of these programs. And if you look at the data, like for example, when we look back on it for the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, obviously pre-1964, racism was kind of the norm in a lot of places around the country. And Black people were literally like, there was for sure systemic racism and oppression, because it would specifically say in Southern states laws that like Black people have this set of rules and white have this set. That kind of gets rid of it. But here's kind of the weird thing about this. When he expanded a lot of these welfare programs and Head Start for young kids and the food stamp program, you would think that that would help reduce poverty and bring people's standard of living up. However, kind of the counter actually happens, that when you go back and look at the data, actually, like specifically the Black community in America, they economically made less than the average white family, all right, the average Black family, but they were making gains. They were actually making more significant gains and getting closer to catching up in the 1950s. You would think that these programs in the 1960s would help accelerate that and get them caught up, but actually it kind of turns. And by the time these programs go into effect, the Black community does not make as good of gains, and it's almost kind of counterproductive. So again, that kind of gets back to like, I really think Lyndon Johnson had the best intentions with this. He was trying to do the right thing, but sometimes you can try to do the right thing, and then you set up the wrong incentive and disincentive type of system, and it actually, your policies end up, even though they look good on the surface, they end up being kind of counterproductive and don't get the results you want. So most people that I've heard that are very critical of Lyndon Johnson and his Great Society programs would say he made the government too big. He took away a lot of people's like incentive to be personally responsible in their own lives, and that it was actually kind of counterproductive, and it hurt poor people more than it actually helped them. So it's kind of a mixed bag, and that's kind of Salukie's take, I guess, summing it up. But I'm not the end all be all. I mean, you research this on your own. I would listen to other people too, because I have heard people really spin it in a positive way and say that we're grateful for a lot of his programs. I mean, currently, right now, Biden is actually looking to kind of do a almost like a second Great Society, where he is, or he's called it like a New Deal or the Green New Deal. You'll hear get spun out, where he's really trying to, I think, expand on some of these programs in the post COVID world. So overall, very controversial. Here's a couple political cartoons for you, both of them featuring Lyndon Johnson. This one, he's playing the piano. If you follow my cursor over here, the 88th Congress, that would have been the Congress that was in session when he was elected. You see all of this music coming out of the piano. You have defense appropriation, that's money for the military. Civil rights bills, that would be the 64 and 65 civil rights and voting rights acts. So East Asia resolution, that's kind of tying into Vietnam. Anti-poverty legislation, that all of this stuff's coming out. There was a ton of profound changes for sure in the beginning of his time as president. This one over here is kind of, I think, picking on him a little bit more, showing that big like cash cow, this big cow that's about to go get slaughtered, prize bull or whatever, and it's got like hunks of fat. Where if you ever heard of barrel spending, now that'd be a pig, but making the same kind of comparison here, that like the government's getting too big and they're handing out too much money as it's all being allotted to different and earmarked for different purposes. All right, that's all I have for you today. Hopefully this all made sense to you. It might not be the most exciting lecture I've done all year when we're focusing on like specific legal changes and policy like reforms, but it is some kind of important stuff that's very much affected American history. And I think the effects of the Great Society, for better or worse, echo on through, and we're still feeling the ramifications of these policies on through to today. All right, have questions? Hit me up.